It's the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Pires coming to you from Baltimore. Imperialism, a highly contested term in political science. One form of imperialism is the act of using your military for expanding and extending borders and conquering land. Now, there is a less invasive form, at least less invasive militarily, but imperialism also could include gaining influence through political and economic means via a free market economy, which also subjugate foreign countries to adhere to the national interests of the imperial state via the marketplace. Now, we saw both of these forms of imperialism coming together when we, meaning the U.S., invaded Iraq. Now, the U.S. invasion of Iraq was done under a false claim that Saddam Hussein and Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. Now, they did this to gain access to exploiting the natural resources that Iraq had, which is oil, and getting rid of Saddam Hussein really helped in order to gain control of the oil wells, the oil contracts, the resources and the oil itself coming out of Iraq. Now, if the British Empire grew very powerful by dominating foreign markets, natural resources, and of course cheap labor in the colonies, so could the U.S. Now, Karl Marx posed the question, if it is worth it to impoverish millions of workers in the East Indies in order to procure for just 1.5 million workers in England in the same industry. Now, that question has become even more relevant today when it comes to the U.S. and its mission or imperialistic ambitions abroad. Now, President Trump, during his inauguration, drew a direct connection between U.S. imperialism and the U.S. working class and how his plans, his vision for the United States could benefit its workers. Let's listen.
From this day forward, it's going to be only America first. America first. Every decision on trade, on taxes, on immigration, on foreign affairs will be made to benefit American workers and American families.
In a new book titled Changing Face of Imperialism, edited by Sunanda Sen and Maria Cristina Marcuzzo, Professor Gerald Epstein has a chapter in that book he wrote a while ago, Do U.S. Workers Gain from U.S. Imperialism? In this chapter, Gerald Epstein calculated that between 1985 and 2000, the bottom 80% of Americans lost between $400 billion and $2.8 trillion as a direct result of U.S. imperialism. Well, on to talk about this with me is Gerald Epstein. He is co-director of the Political Economy Research Institute at UMass Amherst, and he's professor of economics there as well. Good to have you back with us, Jerry.
Thank you, Sharmini, for having me.
Jerry, let's start with why you embarked on this endeavor in the first place to explore if the U.S. worker actually gains or benefits from U.S. imperialism.
Right, as you said, I wrote this chapter actually quite a while ago, just as the United States was about to invade Iraq in 2003. And the question I was asking myself is, well, this seemed to be a wildly popular decision on the part of the Bush administration, George W. Bush, including among workers. And the question I was asking myself is why? This seemed like such a despicable, immoral, and crazy act. Why was it so wildly popular among people, including the U.S. working class? So I decided to actually go out and try to put together a conceptual framework, look at the numbers, and see whether in the recent past, at that time, US workers had benefited from US imperialism. And as you suggested in your introduction, there are different ways to think about imperialism. One is imperialism that involves the use of military force to achieve hegemony over other countries and extract benefits from them. And since I was interested in the invasion of Iraq, I decided to try to estimate mostly that kind of imperialism. And there's a more informal type of imperialism just based on various kinds of subtle powers the US might have that influence the International Monetary Fund, other countries' trade policies, their foreign aid policies, et cetera. These I put on one side. So I was really looking at what I called the iron fist imperialism, the involvement of military force. And I found, as you suggested, that in fact, US workers in the 15 years before the invasion lost from US imperialism. And so I tried to calculate both the benefits and the costs. So what could the possible benefits to US workers be? Well, Michael Clare and others argued that a lot of US foreign policy has been directed towards controlling oil in the Middle East. And clearly the invasion of Iraq was connected with that whole endeavor to control the supply of oil. So one issue is, well, who benefits from oil prices being lower and oil prices being more stable? A second role of imperialism is for the United States to be able to borrow money from the rest of the world at an incredibly low interest rate because of the role of the dollar, which is maintained partly by military force that the United States exerts. So what is the benefit to workers of getting lower interest loans from the rest of the world and getting things more cheaply? So those are benefits. What are the costs to US workers? Well, of course, there's the cost of blood, human life. A lot of the military is supplied by US workers, but I didn't include that. That's clearly negative. But the other costs is the budgetary expenditure, military expenditures, which in the United States are massive. And who pays for those? Who pays the tax burden to pay for those military expenditures? So when I added it all up, what I came out with was the figures you mentioned, was that in fact the US workers as a group, you can measure them as the lower 60% of the income distribution, the lower 80% of the income distribution, lost tremendously, as much as $2 trillion or so economically from imperialism. I also conjectured that, is this always true? In the 1960s, 1950s, 1970s, I didn't study this period, but I looked at it, and it seemed like the argument is stronger that during that period, US workers did benefit from some of the imperialistic adventures that the US government engaged in. Part of the reason is because US workers didn't have to pay as much of the burden. The tax system was much more progressive in those times. Richer people paid a higher percentage of taxes. And the costs of military adventures were less. But by the time of the 1980s, US workers clearly were not benefiting economically from this. So if US workers are supporting these kinds of military adventures, it's not really for economic reasons, according to my analysis. Something else is going on, which kind of raises the question, what could be going on in the future if President Trump and his administration decides to get into another big war in the Middle East, say with Iran or other military adventures? Would they be popular among US workers? And it's unlikely it would be so for economic reasons. There would have to be other reasons.
So, Jerry, the tendency of the working class to actually be right-wing and support wars, which is a well-known phenomenon. You know, most of the right-wing sections of the United States tend to be supporters of military action by the United States. Now, even when it is obvious that empires and missions of the empires serve mainly the upper classes, it is often the lower classes that actually have to pay the price. It is the lower classes that are mainly in the military. And so I think Marx referred to this as false consciousness on the part of the working class. Do you think that by measuring and publishing the cost of the empire the way you have, and its impact it's having on the working class, is it possible to conceive that people will abandon the kind of thinking that they are having about warmongering in particular?
Well, I think the roots of this kind of support for military adventures, just as the roots xenophobia and the roots of racism and anti-immigrant feelings and so forth, are much deeper than pure economics. I guess my view is that it could help. At the margins, publishing these kinds of this kind of information, pointing out the economic costs to people who might otherwise support these kinds of policies, especially since Trump, in this case, has really put it in economic terms, putting America first, helping workers. So to confront that kind of argument directly may have a small impact, and I think it's worth doing.
And to dispel the myths associated with this kind of empire, mission of the empire impacting the workers, what are some of the big data items that we could draw on to shift public opinion?
Well, first of all, the cost of the military and who's paying the taxes to support the military, or whose government benefits are being cut as a result of this kind of expenditure. That's number one. Number two, of course, is who's paying the price in terms of having to be, as you said, in the military and losing their lives. The impact on veterans who's pay such a heavy price, and the government is not taking care of the veterans. These are all things which are, in some sense, obvious, but is worth harping on, being clear on, in terms of these kinds of costs. Ultimately, though, there's this huge moral question. Is it morally correct to engage in this kind of destructive activity, killing thousands of people in other countries under these kinds of conditions? Of course, the answer is no. So I don't mean that these economic arguments should displace the much more important strategic and moral issues, but it's an additional argument to emphasize.
All right. I know various economists like yourself and Joseph Stiglitz, who wrote the book on the $3 trillion cost of the war in Iraq, for example, are trying to draw attention to it. I hope that it starts to catch on in a more popular way, because I think that's when people really realize, we're paying for this and we're losing our lives, and we need to do something about it. So I thank you so much for joining us today, Gerald, and I do hope you come back soon.
Okay, thanks, Sharmini.
And thank you for joining us here on the Real News Network.